All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Victor Sowers. I'm on the biz dev team here at CB Insights. Just going to sort of handle the logistics here at the beginning and introduce my colleague Nikhil, and then we'll take it from there. So first things first, if you have sort of any technical issues, there is a support link here. You can just sort of Google Citrix Online, and they have a good help desk, and they'll get you in. But if you can't get back on, not to worry. We are going to distribute both the slides and the recording immediately after the webinar. So we'll get those to you sort of within a couple days. We are at CB Insights. We'll be participating on Twitter throughout the conversation here today with the hashtag Autotech as well. So feel free to ping us with insights, questions, whatever. We'll be on and listening. All right, so just a little bit about Nikhil. So he's a research analyst here at CB Insights, and he focuses a lot on sort of data-driven analysis and research that spans a lot of sort of the private company landscape, including financing, exit, performance trends across emerging industries, geographies, and investors. Obviously, he's focused a lot on sort of the autonomous vehicle and sort of connected car space, but his range of research also covers biotech, drug development, digital health, consumer products. And Nikhil, prior to CB Insights, came from a couple other startups, including Relationship Science, Global Thermostat, and Uber. And his research has been featured several times in sources like the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, New York Times, and so on and so forth. So we're in good hands here with Nikhil. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him to get started on the content.
Unmuted.
Thanks, Victor. So today we're going to talk a little bit about auto tech. So what's coming, who are the main people in the space, and how it's going to change our lives. So first, a little bit about CB Insights. So we're backed by the National Science Foundation and use machine learning and data science to help our customers predict what's next. So whether that's their next market, next partnership, next move of their competitor, or next acquisition. We're used by some of the world's leading corporations, including Cisco, Castrol, Salesforce, and many others. So our mantra is, in God we trust, all others must bring data. So our analyses aren't based in punditry or baseless opinions, which is common in private markets, but rather our research is grounded in data. So that's where this motto comes from. Okay, so on to auto tech. With the limited time we have, we're going to take a look at, one, the activity in auto tech in private markets, so things like funding trends, investors, and different areas that these companies are targeting. After that, we'll dive a bit into auto insurance and how that space is changing. Then we'll take a look at what it means for cars as they slowly become a computer and who that's going to benefit. Then we'll take a look at the corporates that are actually building the autonomous cars. And finally, we'll wrap up the webinar talking a little bit about the regulatory issues surrounding self-driving cars and what the future is going to look like once these cars actually hit the road. So before we start, let's define auto tech. So as we're talking about it, auto tech is software-based technology that's used within automobiles to improve driving efficiency and safety. So this isn't going to include things like the industrial aspects of the car, like manufacturing, or the commerce aspects. So things like used car marketplaces or on-demand services. But what we are going to be talking about are things like assisted driving and autonomous software, driver safety tools, driving data and connected car, fleet telematics, and really anything that's tracking vehicles from long distances, vehicle-to-vehicle communication, and auto cybersecurity. So we'll dive a little bit more into these sectors later on in the webinar. So is auto tech a big deal, and why should we care about it? So in 2013, more than 30,000 people died in the US due to automobile accidents. This is a number that auto tech is going to greatly reduce. The average American spends more than 45 minutes a day driving, and that can eventually be spent doing other things and might fundamentally change how our cities are mapped out. The typical US family spends nearly a fifth of their income on transportation, so obviously this issue matters a lot to consumers. And Lux Research posits that self-driving cars are an 87 billion opportunity in 2030. So everyone from auto manufacturers and infotainment systems have the opportunity to get into this industry. So let's start at the private market landscape. So We use CB Insights data to monitor what's happening with auto tech companies. So deal activity has continued to pick up. There's been more than 30 deals already closed in 2015, which is more than any year prior. We've seen some funding spikes. So in 2013, Mobileye, a company that specializes in driver assistance systems, raised a $400 million round before its IPO. 2015 has already seen $374 million raised, and that funding has been spread out across several large deals rather than concentrated into any one company. In the earlier years, so from 2009 to 2013 or so, auto tech really saw a lot of enterprise use cases. So things like fleet telematics or hardware companies that supply sensors. But recently, we're seeing a lot more in the consumer-facing space. So things like smart car plugins, infotainment, and insurance, among others. When we look at the stage breakdown, 44% of all auto tech deals have happened at the earliest stages since 2009. So we're talking about Angel, Seed, and Series A specifically. The industry is still relatively young. Most of the financings this year were also in the early and mid stage. But as the industry matures, we can expect to see more financings happening in the later stages as well. When it comes to geographies, California is by far the furthest ahead. They saw more than 60 deals in auto tech, with the state being one of the few that has actually enacted any laws to allow companies to test their autonomous vehicles on the road. There's actually been a lot of activity outside of the US, especially in Asia. So companies like Mobileye, which went public, paved the way for a lot of other startups in Israel. China and India have also seen a handful of financings in companies that are based out there. So who are the top investors? When we take a look at the top investors in auto tech, there are a lot of corporations. And what's interesting is that these corporations actually come from all different sides sort of the equation. So from the tech side, you see Intel and Qualcomm. From the automotive supplier side, there's Magna. From the telecom side, there's Nokia Growth Partners. And even from the lubricants and oil side, there's Castrol. All of these sort of have some investments that overlap between them. Each of them sort of brings a different strategic partnership angle to this investment. It's important to note that Nokia has actually raised a $100 million fund dedicated to connected cars. So we might see more of these specialized funds pop up in the future. In general, though, Intel has been the most active investor in this space. So it's clear that corporates play a huge role for private companies from a strategic perspective. So we're going to take a look specifically at General Motors activity, since they're one of the more active automakers that are investing in private markets. As a whole, auto corporations are trying to stay innovative by investing and acquiring private companies. So we use the CB Insights social graph to basically make a map of where these automakers are putting their money. So several auto corporations like BMW, Audi, and GM have all established their own venture arms. And as you can see from the chart, GM is one of the most active in this group, investing both through GM Ventures as well as their parent corporation. GM is also one of the few automakers that actually invests outside of tech companies. So they've made heavy investments in renewable energy like biofuels and solar companies, battery technology like Suck-D3, which was recently acquired, some new materials companies, and even other electric vehicles like Proterra and Bright Automotive. GM is not averse to investing in tech, so they invested in a few companies, especially in the ride sharing and vehicle renting space. So there's Flink and Turo, which recently rebranded from Relay Rides and actually raised a huge round really recently. So while GM is investing across a broad range of sectors in the auto industry, we're going to highlight some of the auto tech companies and some of the specific sectors they're working in. So this is a graphic we put together to sort of just show all the different ways that startups are attacking the auto industry. So this is really a market map for private companies in the general auto space, everything from engines and tires to software companies. Auto tech is really just one part of this entire ecosystem that we're going to dive into. And I'm not going to spend too much time analyzing each individual company. But like we said, the slides are going to be distributed later. You can take a look at these companies yourselves or look them up on our platform. But we'll start at fleet telematics. So Like I said earlier, this is one of the sectors that saw early adoption for auto tech. So companies like Telligis, Green Road, and Vnomics have all used installed hardware, or now actually sometimes smartphones, to capture data about the driving habits and fuel efficiency of truck drivers. And fleet telematics and really any automated car company relies on vehicle-to-vehicle communication tech, which essentially lets cars make decisions based on their surroundings. And these are some of the companies that are working in this space, either in cars, in trucks, or other vehicles. So while the previous companies focused a little bit more on the enterprise use cases, consumer companies are really starting to take off. So one of the more popular consumer areas for auto tech companies are these connected car companies. So a lot of them are finding different ways to capture and utilize the data that come from existing automobiles. So either for personal use or using them in different third-party ecosystems. And connected cars are really just a stepping stone towards full driver assistance and automated cars. So these are some companies that are trying to turn dumb machines into smart vehicles using groups of sensors and different complex software. So some of these companies are retrofitting older vehicles, and some of them, like RoboCV, are working on warehouse vehicles, which sort of face their own host of problems. And as more of these vehicles become connected, the need for cybersecurity is definitely growing. So this is a currently really small but fast-growing field and hasn't seen a ton of investment yet, and is definitely a ripe opportunity for investors. We'll talk a little bit more about cybersecurity later in the presentation, but this is just something to keep in mind. And last but not least, we have the driver safety companies. So these are companies that are trying to find ways to improve driver safety outside of automation. So some of these analyze driving behavior and provide coaching. Others are trying to keep your eyes on the road. Insurance is particularly interested in this space since it'll help reduce payouts. And speaking of insurance, how are these technologies we've been talking about transforming the gargantuan auto insurance industry? So insurance companies know auto tech is going to fundamentally sort of change the future of their industry. So Tom Wilson, Allstate CEO, has acknowledged that auto tech is going to reduce the cost of insurance, not just for the average consumer, but also for auto companies and insurance firms themselves. So today, traditional insurance models price their premiums using really broad data sets and then applying those variables to the individual level. So this is a snapshot from the Insurance Information Institute and shows a few examples where we see this kind of generalized data. So basically taking people in an age bracket and applying those to specific individuals, or how certain genders drive and applying those again at the individual level. But tech is actually going to allow these companies to get much more specific and granular data from each person so that they'll be able to cater their plans better and more effectively. And with more usage-based insurance products, so things like connected car dongles and telematics, we're seeing a lot of new models of insurance. So things like pay-as-you-drive and manage how you drive programs, which are helping to incentivize good driver behavior. So this is obviously huge for insurance companies. And not only do they incentivize safe driving and reduce crashes, but connected cars are going to allow them to sort of monitor the car vitals, take preventative measures, and suggest routine checkups and fixes. They can provide quick responses and assess damage should accidents happen, and they'll be able to prevent fraud. So this is a $700 billion area of insurance where costs can be drastically reduced thanks to smarter cars. And many of the major insurance carriers in the US have some form of UBI-based discounts for their policies, though this varies state to state. So as a whole, the current market for UBI incentives is pretty small. So just about 8.5% of people have encountered a UBI policy in their insurance in 2014. But that's still doubled from the year previous, and awareness of UBIs are starting to increase with many consumers. A lot of consumers are actually said they're willing to change their driver behavior and pay for value-add services in the future. 36% of all carriers are expected to have some sort of UBI integration in their insurance premiums by 2020, but this could accelerate depending on how the technology improves and how much more granular data we're getting from these devices. And as we have more instruments to capture this data, our car slowly stops being just a car and then sort of starts moving towards another computer. So this entire section is going to be dedicated to what it means for our car to be a computer. So again, we'll just start with a few relevant stats. The average commuter spends 25 to 30 minutes traveling each way, which is time that could be spent doing other things. The in-car infotainment industry is poised to go rapidly, becoming a $14.4 billion industry in 2016. And unfortunately, more than 650,000 people in the US already use an electronic device while driving, despite the fact that it's extremely dangerous. Recently, BCG surveyed 1,000 people and asked what they were excited about for the future of autonomous vehicles. And the third most popular after safety and lower insurance costs were allowing for multitasking and productivity. So this is clearly a really popular area for consumers who want to stay productive during their commutes. So we're going to break down the internal car computer into a few different sections. So we're going to start with onboard vehicle systems. So as less focus is needed to pay attention to the road ahead, our screens are going to start becoming a much more important feature in the car. So on the left, we see the 1986 Buick Riviera, which is one of the first cars to ever have a touchscreen in it. And on the right, we see today's 2015 Tesla Model S, which has a 17-inch console. So we can already see a trend emerging with bigger screens taking the place in cars. But in the future, where we might not need to pay attention to the road at all, screens are going to become even more present. So this is the Mercedes F15 concept car. As you can see, there are screens sort of everywhere. So screens on the doors, screens on the back of the car, screens on the tablet in the middle. So even though this is just a concept car, it's pretty clear where the priorities are going in terms of interior design. And more screens are a huge deal for the ad and commerce industry. So not only are they going to get more granular location and lifestyle data based on how you drive, but with that, what information they send to the driver is going to become really important. So, imagine a scenario where you're driving down the highway and several restaurants are going to want to ask if you're interested in stopping by, but then the question is who gets through. And commuters are going to have an extra 45 minutes to use the internet, which is a domain where ads and commerce obviously play a huge role. This is why companies like Google, Baidu, and Alibaba are heavily investing into cars, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So while safety and autonomous driving show the most growth for the future in the automobile industry, the development of those features are going to free time to do other things on the road. So Strategy N forecasts that the in-car services industry is going to triple in size to more than 30 billion euros, or a $32.6 billion industry in 2021. So this is going to include things like regular entertainment systems and management systems to help you analyze your car vitals or road info for the future. But not only that, we might see the development of things like wellness systems to promote things like driver health and well-being, and home integration as the smart home industry continues to develop. So imagine being able to control your appliances like your air conditioner straight from your car. And this is going to have a much broader implication. So our screens are essentially going to be everywhere. So having a seamless experience moving from one screen to the next is going to be very important to consumers. And that's sort of where tech companies are going to have a leg up in the car building process. Many of them, like Apple and Google, are already on our other smart devices, like our smartphones or certain smart products within our homes. So they'll be able to do this data transfer much easier. And with more screens and smarter cars, we're going to need much more connectivity, which is why telecoms see a very bright future in the auto space. So AT&T, which is one of the more aggressive telecom companies in the self-driving car arena, added a total of 1.6 million connected devices in Q3 15, and of those, 1 million were connected cars. So that should already show you just how fast this industry is going. And telecom companies can start bundling their services, so they can include cars in their bundles, which will keep customers sticky and also force them to buy larger ticket items. So these telecom companies are setting themselves up in different ways to catch this wave of technology. These are just a handful of partnerships that are happening, but you can see that companies like AT&T and T and Verizon are partnering currently with some of the more major auto manufacturers to make sure they're the go-to connectivity solution. And even outside the U.S., China Telecom has partnered with Gemalto to offer instant connectivity for any car for auto manufacturers. And it's not just partnerships. A lot of these companies are making investments and acquisitions to stay ahead of the curve in this space. So Verizon and Vodafone have both acquired telematics companies and are sort of going in from that route, while Deutsche Telekom has invested in Mojio, which is a connected car startup. And it's not just one way either. So Audi has actually invested in a telecom network through their venture arm. So Cubic Telecom provides connectivity for all IoT products, including smart cars. And another big thing that telecom companies are thinking about are 5G networks. So autonomous cars are a big driver in the development of 5G. So currently the 4G networks that we use have a latency of about 140 milliseconds, which is fine for our current use cases, but could mean life or death in an autonomous car. 5G networks will have a 1 millisecond latency, and they're being developed all around the world. So companies like Huawei and SK Telecom have made it very clear about their intentions for R&D in the 5G space, and they've partnered with hardware companies to develop and implement this technology. There's a general consensus that 5G networks should arrive by 2020. And faster networks means we're going to need faster processors. So this is going to make the role of electronics within cars, especially chips and semis, much, much more important. So important that a company like NVIDIA, which has typically made GPUs for computers, saw most of its growth in the autonomous vehicle space. And now the company is refocusing a large part of its efforts to focus in that area. The company recognizes that the auto industry is going to eventually need very powerful processors, so they want to be one of the leading providers, and they're going to be competing with people like Qualcomm and Samsung. And semiconductors are another area that is positioned to take advantage of this growth. So even though automotive isn't the largest market for semiconductors, it's definitely one of the most fastest growing. The industry is projected to have a nearly 10% compound annual growth rate through 2017. And many of the larger semiconductor businesses like Freescale and NXP are seeing a lot more revenue come from the automotive side of their business, with both of them actually making a combined $3 billion in revenue in 2014. And as the car starts utilizing more software, analyzing more inputs, and sort of moves towards becoming a more complex computer, more and more of the automobile cost is going to be rooted in the electronics. So much more that PwC actually sees a projection where 50% of the automobile cost is based in the electronics in 2030. So again, as these cars get more connected, cybersecurity is becoming much more of an issue. So there was a pretty well-publicized report that came out earlier this year about researchers who were actually able to hack into a Jeep system while it was on the highway and kill the systems remotely. This actually caused Chrysler to recall 1.4 million vehicles that had this security bug. So clearly this is something to watch out for. And the problem is that with more software in cars, there are a lot more entry points for hackers to take control of a system. So vulnerabilities exist both in the software as well in the hardware. So that makes this a particularly tough problem to solve. So as you can see in this graphic from Intel, these are just some of the entry points that hackers can use to get into our cars. But luckily, there is some progress being made. So there's a new bill that's currently being drafted that would allow the NHTSA to form a committee that establishes cybersecurity standards across the industry and makes sure that safe products are hitting the roads. Intel has also established an automotive security review board, which is going to bring together some of the brightest minds to sort of research cybersecurity flaws on Intel products that are used in automobiles. And an information sharing and analysis center, which is also known as an ISAC, has been established for the major automakers. So they'll be able to share data with each other about threats and vulnerabilities to better protect not only themselves, but the entire industry going forward. So while there's definitely still a lot of work to be done, these are just some of the steps that are being taken to move in that direction. So who are the people that are actually building the autonomous vehicles? So it's clear that it's not just auto manufacturers anymore. Now tech companies are trying to become car makers themselves. But automakers think that tech is severely underestimating just how tough it is to build a car. So many of these auto companies have taken decades to perfect things like their supply chain, assembly, material sourcing, general logistics, and think tech is really in over its head. These are just some of the quotes from Elon Musk and Bob Lutz, people who are sort of veterans in the industry, both of who've expressed skepticism in the ability for tech companies to sort of reach these goals as quickly as they say they can. So what do these cars actually look like? So on the left, we see a snapshot from a commercial GM put out in the 1950s of the Firebird 2 autonomous vehicle concept. So in this commercial, a family radios into a central communication tower and asks to go into autonomous mode. And after getting permission, they go into a specialized lane for that. So this is kind of like how airlines work today. And then next to it, we see Google's self-driving car prototype, which obviously looks very different and operates very differently as well. So we're going to go through some of the key players that are building self-driving cars. We have a much more comprehensive list on our research blog, which I've linked below. But I'm just going to highlight a few key points about some of these major players. But feel free to read more in depth when the slides are distributed or on our blog itself. But we'll start with Apple. So the company is Project Titan, which they've actually kept very much under wraps. But we know that they've poached several auto engineers and engineers from computer companies in the recent months, and they have been testing their vehicles at an ex-military base. The company's also approached the California DMV to test cars on the roads, but we're still not totally sure about many of the details happening within Apple. So Audi actually has 3 different autonomous car prototypes. They actually started with 2 racing vehicles, and now their consumer-facing vehicle was actually able to drive itself from California all the way to Las Vegas in autonomous mode. Audi is also part of the Auto Coalition that bought Nokia's mapping assets earlier this year for $2.7 billion. And in China, Baidu has actually partnered with BMW to release a self-driving prototype by the end of the year. So just like Google, Baidu has a very robust mapping platform and has also acquired a few companies to bolster this. The company has been testing this technology on the highways of Beijing and Shanghai for the last couple months. So Google is by far the most public about their driverless car efforts. One thing that's not clear is whether or not Google will be building cars themselves or partnering with existing auto manufacturers. So they've publicly said that their goal is to partner with these auto companies, but they've actually incorporated Google Auto and have registered themselves as a vehicle maker in the state of California. So these are just some clues that suggest they might be building cars themselves, but again, this is still a bit unclear. Also interesting to note that Google's self-driving cars have been involved in a few accidents, which you can see on the DMV website, but the company has insisted that the root cause of all these accidents have been human intervention. So Mercedes has been testing out their self-driving tech for a few years now. Some models have a stop and go mode, which lets cars navigate themselves while in traffic. But what's interesting about Mercedes is that they've talked about creating an on-demand fleet which can be summoned, and that would potentially be competing with ride-sharing companies like Uber. And Uber themselves have made it clear that they're going to pursue driverless technology, especially since that's one of the highest costs in their entire operation. So they're working with talent from a couple universities to develop this technology. And they could actually be competing with Google's driverless cars, even though Google is actually an investor in the company. And finally, there's Tesla. So Tesla has pushed the closest thing that consumers currently have to autonomous vehicles. So with its recent autopilot push, cars essentially can go into virtually autonomous mode on the highways as long as the driver's hands are within range. And Elon Musk said he expects the cars to be ready in the next 5 or so years, and that the biggest impediments have actually been infrastructure issues. So things like faded lines, skid marks on highways, so things like that. So as these corporations start building out these cars, there are certain questions that have to be asked and regulations that have to be formed. So we're going to take a look at the current state of affairs there. So today, the NHTSA has defined autonomous cars in 5 stages. So each one of these stages increasingly cedes more functions to software. So beginning in level 1, we see autonomous features in emergency situations. Then we move through level 2, which is cruise control, and level 3, which is supervised autonomous driving. But as we approach level 4, which is full autonomy, there's a lot more scrutiny, a lot more data that needs to be tested, and a lot more regulations that need to be formed. So what's the current state of regulation? So right now, California, Nevada, Michigan, Florida, and DC are the states that have passed definitive legislation about rules for auto tech. So in the other states, they're either considering bills currently or bills have been struck down and they're currently being iterated upon. California was one of the first states to pass these laws and has been the testing ground for almost every major autonomous player in the world. And these complicated regulatory hurdles in the US could actually put it at a disadvantage on the world stage. So China has a huge impetus to enact self-driving cars. It currently sees more than 200,000 automobile-related deaths each year, according to the World Health Organization, and has some of the worst highway traffic issues in the world. The country could also enact sweeping regulatory change across the country much faster than the US could. Europe as a whole has been very progressive about its auto tech laws. So the continent actually takes the largest revenue percentage of all advanced driver's assistance systems in the world, and also has the highest penetration rate for smarter cars on vehicle in the road. Officials in the EU have also been very vocal about bringing driverless tech to their countries. So several countries like the UK and Germany have passed legislation for self-driving testing grounds and established task force to continue to develop more regulation. So what are some of the tougher questions that regulators are going to need to answer? We're going to go through a few of them here. So autonomous cars bring the infamous trolley problem to life. So the real question is, how should cars be programmed to make ethical decisions? Situations where the car needs to kill the driver if it means saving a group of people that are in harm's way. And would people buy cars that are programmed to kill them in those situations? And the recent Volkswagen scandal has actually forced us to ask the question now, should companies be self-reporting their stats? Currently, most companies report data themselves to third-party organizations. This is an effort to keep innovation streamlined, but as we saw with the VW emissions scandal, one that was rooted in software for the most part, this might have been proven to be a poor choice. Google is currently reluctant on releasing their data to third-party organizations and don't think there's an organization equipped to really understand the technology that goes behind these cars. So the question arises, who should be in charge of this data? And then the big question is where the liability falls in the event of a crash. So is it the automaker's fault if the crash is due to human behavior, even if they were responding to a glitch in the driver assistance software? If the car gets into an accident due to an infrastructure problem, like an unmarked part of the highway, is it the government's fault? These are just some of the liability questions to think about. And finally, in the far future, when autonomous cars become more mainstream and software becomes more advanced, should humans even be allowed to drive cars at all? So Elon Musk thinks the goal is to remove humans from the equation completely, especially since humans are the cause of hundreds of thousands of automobile deaths in the world each year. But then the question is the public going to be ready to cede that freedom? So we'll find out in the future as autonomous vehicles become more mainstream. But beyond the regulatory hurdle, there's a bright future. So I'm going to take the last few slides to just list a few projections that we might expect to see. So like we talked about before, one of the greatest outcomes of this is going to be the reduction of car accidents. So there won't be hazardous situations due to things like drunk driving or falling asleep at the wheel, and the auto casualty numbers are going to go way down. And traffic is virtually going to become non-existent. So you can imagine not having to deal with the frustration of bumper to bumper, inch by inch traffic that a few of us have have definitely experienced. With autonomous cars, less accidents definitely means less highway blockage, and integrated networks and the detailed maps means cars will be able to avoid these situations pretty much altogether. But even if you should get stuck in a traffic jam for some reason, your car is essentially going to become a mobile office. So you'll be able to continue doing work during your commute and even have meetings if you wanted to. And as those commutes become easier and more productive, we can expect people to move away from dense cities and into the suburbs. So this might lead to a phenomenon known as urban sprawl, which has typically had negative connotations in the past, but with the ease of transport in the future, this might actually change those outcomes. And suburbanization isn't the only urban change this might lead to. As more people use autonomous on-demand fleets and cars are sort of able to find and park themselves, we'll have much less of a need for parking garages. And last, and maybe the most counterintuitive change is that with autonomous cars, less people are actually going to own cars. So cars are one of the fastest depreciating assets that people buy. So autonomous fleets like the ones Uber and Mercedes are working on are going to become a much more cost-effective form of transport. So most cars aren't even utilized at a given time. So these fleets actually are a more efficient use of the resource. And in the future, seeing multiple cars in a driveway might actually be a rare sight. So I know I went through a lot today, but if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or email me at nkrishnan@cbinsights.com. I know there was a lot there, and we're going to take the last few minutes to answer a few questions from you guys. But again, if I don't get to your questions, we're going to make our best effort to try and answer them and get back to you. And again, you can also reach out to me directly through either of those means. So let me just take a look. So what are the biggest industries autonomous cars are going to change, and what are new industries that are going to be created? So I think that really any industry related to driving safety or the act of driving itself is going to change drastically. So for safety, we talked a little bit about insurance, but there's going to be other things like the auto repair industry, which is inevitably going to get smaller as less crashes happen. And then obviously actual drivers, so people in the trucking and taxi industry. As a whole, that industry is probably going to get much smaller. As for new industries, there's definitely going to be a lot of infrastructure change and sort of jobs associated with that. So, new infrastructures like charging stations for cars and people to manage those, and then people to actually manage the autonomous fleets themselves. It's a bit tough to know all the industries that might pop up without knowing the regulation that's going to happen, but these are definitely a few of them. So what is the rollout procedure for autonomous cars? So if I understand this question correctly, this is talking about how we're going to get to autonomous cars. I don't think this is going to be a sudden change. Josh Koppelman from First Round Capital has sort of outlined what the rollout might look like. And I actually agree for the most part with his points. So first, we're going to see things like the retrofitting of old cars and factory installed hardware into some of the newer models that are coming out. Then we'll see the connectivity side of it. So as telecom companies sort of get more involved and 5G networks get developed, these cars are going to become much faster. And then the third, we're going to see the established regulation about who's driving, who's controlling the cars, where the liability is. So after that, I think we're going to see some real mainstream adoption. So what's the most controversial opinion on connected cars? Or my personal most controversial opinion. I really think it is whether or not people will be driving cars in the future, because for a lot of people, driving a car is not just sort of mode of transport, but also it's tied to things like your ability to freely transport yourself, or people actually enjoy the thrill of driving a car, and it's therapeutic for a lot of people. So, but the problem is that autonomous vehicles work the best when all vehicles are autonomous and we have a very centralized network. So I think that's going to be a very divisive issue in the future. And I know a lot of the car corporations are actually very split on this as well, with some of them wanting to totally automate the driver and others of them trying to sort of provide the software that will sort of just happen in the background and prevent accidents should they happen. So I think that's definitely one of the more controversial things we're going to see in the future. So how is VC looking at the space? So venture capital as an asset class is looking at things in sort of 10 to 15 year horizons. So a lot of VCs are, putting their money in sort of in the stepwise function of these cars being rolled out. So right now we're seeing a lot of funding into things like connected cars, which, as we talked about, falls into the category of retrofitting existing cars. Um, so, VCs are sort of investing in each individual step. So we're also seeing, some companies investing in IoT connectivity products like Cubic Telecom. So it really depends on the VC, their area of expertise, and where they really expect to see returns on their investments. So we have time for one more question. Um, can you expand on how the ad industry might take advantage of this change? Yeah, so we talked a little bit about, the restaurants sort of pushing notifications to you, but I don't think cars are just going to start sort of shooting information to the driver, especially if they're not opting into it. A big part of this is going to be the operating system that these cars run on. So, Apple has recently pushed ad blocking for its mobile phones. So that was a huge blow to the ad industry and definitely something to keep in mind for auto as we go forward. But what's important, though, is that ad formatting is going to have to feel regular in the car. So one of the big issues when mobile came out was that ads were still formatted for desktop. Cars are going to be their own unique platform, so understanding like how people behave during their commutes and that's going to be a huge factor in how ads should be delivered. And there may even be an entirely new type of entertainment that comes out of autonomous cars. So similar to how mobile gave rise to different types of media like Vine and Snapchat. There might be different types of media consumption and therefore different types of ads that are sort of catered to people. So that's all the time we have today, but we'll answer those questions via email for the people that we didn't get to. And again, feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any specific questions. Hope you guys learned a lot about auto tech today. Thanks for joining us.